Take it away, Tricia.
Well, hi, Richard, and hi, everyone. Virginia Ions. I don't see anyone in the chat, so I'm just assuming that's not something I can see. I do like to ask questions before I begin, so maybe you can tell me this, Richard. How many of you have heard my story? It's out there widely. So how many of you are familiar with my story?
I don't see any hands here.
Really? All right, awesome. And what about online?
I don't see Angela's the only person online that I see, and I don't see her hand going up.
All right, well, cool. Um, so if you're not familiar with my story, I'll tell you a little bit about who I was before my near-death experience and then who I was after. So I was a college student at the University of Texas, and I had grown up very poor. And so college to me was this great, wonderful experience where maybe I could leave my past behind. My mother was super religious, and so I had experienced a lot of physical and emotional and religious abuse growing up. And so by the time I was in seventh grade, I really turned to education. Teachers were kind to me, and I looked at education as this way out of poverty and this way out of the predicament that I was in. And I looked at religion as not really doing my mom very much good other than keeping her in an unhappy marriage. And my father was a very loving guy, but he was not around very much. And so childhood was difficult and school was my escape. So by the time I got to college, I was ready to take on the world and I was ready to really just get my life on the right track. But what I realized when I got there is that emotionally, my tank was empty and that I was hurting emotionally deeply. I identified as agnostic, and fast forward, through the college years, my senior year at the University of Texas, I was in a massive car wreck on the way to run the Austin 10K. And when this wreck happened, being the agnostic that I was, it was hard for me to even send up a prayer or anything along those lines, but it was somewhat of a foxhole prayer where I felt this moment where I was like, God, if you're there, please help me. I need help in this moment. And I couldn't reach my glove box. I knew immediately that, this was a wreck at about 60 miles an hour. And I was in a little Honda Civic in the 90s, that it had crunched up pretty badly. And I was leaning over to one side. I couldn't move. And it was a little bit terrifying because I understood my back was probably broken. I had all kind of injuries, and three people passed by. And you know how when you're in trauma, everything is in slow motion. And I remember a group of teenagers going by. They put on their brakes and they screamed because we looked pretty gruesome. It was a bad wreck. And then they drove on. People didn't have cell phones in the 90s. So I don't know if they drove somewhere and called, but I just know that they didn't get out of the car and help. Now there are laws that require the first person on a scene to get out and help. But another man probably was going to church. He was in this yellow BMW and he had on a tie, and this was Sunday morning, and he passed right by, just kind of glanced and passed by. And the guy who I had been in a wreck with was holding his kid, and their windshield had broken. So he was covered in blood, and so was his 3-year-old child. And I was pretty mangled at that point. So he drove by, then another woman drove by. Finally, a Good Samaritan stopped, and she happened to be a nurse, and she understood that I was in bad shape. And she stayed with me. Her boyfriend ran across the street, called for an ambulance. And I remember at that moment going, I don't have any more control. This is not in my hands anymore. Everything about my life depends on my surgeons, depends on this trip to the hospital. I don't control much at this point. And it was a kind of a terrifying realization, At that point, there wasn't any light. All that I was concerned about was my body. I wasn't going to be able to graduate that year. I kind of understood that immediately, that I had a lot of final exams that were coming up and I wasn't going to be able to take those. I understood I was going to be in the hospital a while. And my main concern was that I would be able to walk. I was a runner. And when I got to the hospital, I didn't have health insurance. One of the weird parts of my story is that I overheard two nurses say they were on the phone with one of the neurosurgeons, and he didn't come in to operate on me because he was on the golf course, and he declined since I didn't have health insurance. And I remember being so angry at that moment and just screaming and going, I'm not a throwaway person. I deserve help. You know, I'm a student. And at that point, an off-duty neurosurgeon came in, Dr. Laura Flan, and she had been on duty. Austin is a college town, so like 50,000 college students. So a lot of accidents happen, and they have always had a lack of neurosurgeons available for all the motorcycle accidents and car accidents and scooter accidents and biking accidents that happen in that town. And she had been on duty for 40 hours. So she looked at my chart and was like, please operate on me. And she said, I will, but I'm tired and I have to go home and eat dinner and I have to take a nap before, because your surgery is going to be very long. So I'll be back and I'll take your case. And I had, and I waited 17 hours without pain meds because I had severe internal injuries and they didn't know when they opened me up to work on my back if I was going to bleed out or not. And that is how I died. So when they took me under, 17 hours later, I was just kind of glad to get out of the pain of my body. I remember anesthesia, and I remember signing a form that said 17% chance of death. And I thought, well, that's kind of high. I'm a young person. I'm physically strong. You know, like I was like, I'll make it. You know, like that was my main thought. And I signed the form, and the next thing I knew, surgery had probably been going on for quite some time. And this is the fun part of the story. You know, the physical world isn't fun, but this is where all the joy began. So I lifted up out of my body and I saw the surgery going on. And I was somewhere like hovering above the scene, maybe to the right a little bit, looking down at the tops of the surgeons' heads. And I actually, the one thing I like about the artwork of my book is they did cover this scene pretty well, where you know you're, as a spirit, you're above looking down, the surgeons are working. My first thought, I had kind of like thoughts all at one time, because the time-space continuum breaks down as soon as you're out of body, and you don't see in the same way because you're not limited by eyes. So you can see behind your head, you can pick up on all kinds of information immediately. You're not limited by the body. And my first thought was, wow, this surgery is really bloody. And I saw all the blood spilling off into the sheets surrounding my back. And I didn't know that they were going to open up my hip too, to take out bone. And so I remember thinking, oh, you know, I have this opening of blood and this opening. And the next thing I realized is that there were two amazing light beings, angels, behind my surgeons. And immediately I felt calm. Just, I felt a combination of things. I felt happy that we go on. I knew immediately, as soon as I was out of body, I was no longer agnostic. You know, like at that point, I was like, oh, spirit continues on after form. And had my near-death experience stopped there and just been that one moment looking into surgery, I would have been convinced for the rest of my life that at a spirit level, death is more of like a birth into a new realm than it is a death. And in that moment, the angels sent light into my spirit form, calmed my spirit down, and then they said, watch this. And they sent light through the doctors, through their hands, into my spine. And I realized that the doctors would pick out the bone fragments, that I would be able to walk. And at the hospital, I had lost feeling in my left leg. So I was deeply concerned that I wasn't going to walk. And they assured me that everything would heal, I would be fine, I would run again, and that, you know, life would be fine at a physical level. So At that point, though, when they said, watch this, the monitor stopped. And I had heard that monitor, in many television shows. And I looked at it and I was like, oh, okay, now I'm dead. So I understood it was an out-of-body experience until that monitor flatlined. And then I was like, now it's a death experience. And so I didn't want to see how they were going to try to revive me. And I left the hospital room. If there's one part of my story that I get so many questions about, it's this next part. But I saw my stepdad get a candy bar from the vending machine. And in the vending machine, he pulled out a Snickers bar. And I remember chuckling almost because I thought, oh, they are always talking about their great eating habits, my mom and stepdad. And look at him. He has a secret sugar fetish. I knew it. And he was a real skinny guy. So he still is. He can eat whatever he wants. And so I kind of chuckled. And then at that point, even though the angels had said I would be back, that I would run, I was already becoming detached from my body. And I thought, well, this is fun. I don't know if I want to go back to that body. And I remember thinking, well, hey, if I don't come back, I hope he's good to my mom. And I hope they know, I love them. And I just felt detachment. Well, people years later, that's a verifiable instance, and I'll get to that at the end of my story. But yes, I did verify it. And at that moment, my mom, and I didn't see them, but I felt them later in my experience. But my mom and biological dad were on their knees praying for me because they both felt this like overwhelming intensity that I had died. So I find it interesting that my biological parents understood when I had left the body. And one of the greatest pains, I think, is losing a child. And I've talked with so many people about that experience because I just believe that we're all psychically connected, and certainly we're connected to close family members. But long story short, with the candy bar right now, I saw him do that. And then at a spirit form, I just left. And it was night. It was early morning when I had the accident. It was night, middle of the night by the time they were operating on me. And I was in the night sky. Everything was beautiful. And then I just transitioned to what looked like the cosmos. There were stars all around me. It was so beautiful. I felt no fear. I just felt freedom and love for everyone I had known. At a soul level, I just thought, hey, have a great life, be good, be better, be kind, and moved on at that level. And in this cosmos, I began to feel a light, kind of like the light that was coming from the angels, but more powerful. And I understood this light was higher consciousness, source, creator, God, whatever name you want to give this. I understood that some of the intelligence of God was moving towards me. And I heard different statements in this light. One was, love is all that you take with you into this realm. Remind them to go to nature, be like a little child. And I started seeing, and you see it almost telepathically broadcast. The life review is what it's often called with near-death experiences. I was only 22. I hadn't lived, uh, a very dramatic life at that point. I had grown up in the country, and I didn't see any of the pain that other people had given me. So I didn't see the abuse. I didn't see any of that. I didn't see negativity because the only thing you take with you into that realm is love. And so I saw myself playing with animals as a kid, and I saw that this was good. I saw myself as a kid praying, and I saw that this was beautiful, that my heart was pure. And then we moved up until like a year or two before my accident, and I saw some people that I worked with at a restaurant. And I had judged them and not taken the time to get to know them. They were a married couple. They weren't a college student like me. And I just thought, ooh, who would have a career waiting tables, like full time? And I was judgmental about the clothes they wore, about who they were. And what I saw was that they went home and they thought I was depressed and they prayed for me. And if a soul can bawl or cry or really see itself differently, I realized that I had missed out on very good people, and so that I had not taken the time to, I was a kid, like I had not taken the time to get to know people, that, my shyness and my insecurity and my judgment had prevented me from knowing some really beautiful people. And I was so honored that they took the time to pray for me. And my soul was like, I'll do better. Like when I go back, I will do much better. I will look into people's hearts. I will definitely uh care about people at a different level. And that was a message too. I believe it was Jesus who said something about looking into the hearts, and God judges us at a heart level. So a lot of times we don't know people's intentions. We don't know how good they are, and what's in their hearts. And that was my main correction. So it wasn't from a place of punishment. And I think a lot of people think of God as a punishing God, but it was really like an elevation. My soul was being taught a lesson of how to be better. And I didn't look at it as, oh, I'm bad. I looked at it as I can do better. Like that was the lesson. And then I transitioned. My soul moved into this beautiful realm where the grass was perfectly green, almost emerald green, just a color I've never seen here. But I understood that in this realm, there was no death, that death did not exist. This was eternity, and this was the perfection. It's like our world, but perfect. And, no tree had any death to it. No blade of grass had any death to it. And my grandfather was the only person who I was close to who was on the other side. And he showed up. And my grandfather was an awesome guy. He died when I was 10 and I was 22 at this time. And if anyone could have that perfect quintessential grandfather, that was my dad's dad. He loved me as his own granddaughter. And when he was dying of leukemia at 10, he wrote me a lot of short stories about what his life was like growing up. And so I loved horses at that time. So he told me about a horse he had had as a kid. He really wanted me to remember him. And when he died in the hospital when I was 10, I was the last person that saw him. I had left something in the room and I ran back in, and he grabbed my hand and he was like, I love you, Tricia. And he waved. And then we went to lunch, and when we came back, he was dead. Uh, when I saw him on the other side, he was probably like 35 or 40. I didn't recognize him except for his jaw, and then he had blue eyes, but they were light more than blue. And they were just blazing with love, kind of like the angels in my near-death experience. He had his physical form, but it was like a light body. That's the best way to describe it. He was beaming with light and love. And I just knew immediately that this was my grandfather. He loved me and all was going to be fine. And people also ask about this part of my near-death experience. And I'm a reluctant medium now, and I do give readings, but what people often ask is, what do people do in the afterlife? Well, your consciousness can participate in this realm. And what my grandfather and I created, or I think he created it more than me, was this beautiful Ford truck that he had given our family. And it had sat in my dad and mom's yard, and they did nothing with it. And it just had rusted. And in heaven, the truck was perfect. It was this beautiful blue color, and it was restored. And as a side note, I'd love to have a truck like that now, just because it was a truck I was in heaven with. And the message to me was like, everything that's lost here, everything that's decayed can be made new again in eternity, can be beautiful and fun. And what he did when I was a kid is he had this field that he would drive the truck through, and I'd sit in the back, and that's what I did there. My soul became like a little kid because that's what I'd heard in the light. And I thought, if I'm going to enter heaven, I'm going to enter it as a kid. And I think people like to be younger, when they take a physical form. Not all people, but most people do. A time when there is no physical pain. But for me, since I was there with my grandfather, it made sense to be a kid. And I sat in the back of the truck, and we just kind of drove through this beautiful field. And then it was almost as if he got information, maybe from God or something. And he looked back at me and he said, well, do you want to continue on? And I understood that what he meant was maybe I wasn't coming back to the body after all, and that maybe I was going to stay there and that I got to meet God next. And so, of course, I was so excited. I was like, yes. And, who's going to turn down an opportunity to meet God? Not me. Like that's exciting. And so, as I left the truck and kind of flew out of the back of the truck, I began to feel people's prayers. And this is where the time continuum breaks down. Like I felt like I'd already been in the afterlife for weeks, months, days, who knows? But probably since I know I died technically for 2.5 or 2 minutes and 45 seconds, all of this was happening in a very short amount of time. So as I was flying towards God, I felt people's prayers. And people often ask about this as well. How do you pray to God? Well, this is what I would like you to remember. If you are praying for someone who is dying, they will hear your prayers. They will feel it at an energetic, vibrational level. So if you simply want to say, I love you to someone who is passing and just talk to them, you can do that and they will feel it. And basically, they'll know that you love them. And if they aren't coming back, they'll just take that love with them. They'll be connected to you. They'll be so happy that you cared about them. Some of my family members' prayers, it was funny, like my mom and dad were earnest and afraid, like they were praying, God, don't let her die, please, please, please. They were begging, at that level. And I felt that. And then my grandmother her prayer was very earnest as well. Just, I love Tricia. I don't want her to die. Another aunt was thinking a little bit more about herself, but she had lost a daughter and she was praying, oh, don't let any other parents go through what I had to go through. Oh God, it's so terrible to lose a kid. Don't let this happen. And so I felt her prayer and her pain. And then I felt, one aunt who was the most religious in my family, kind of dutifully praying, but there was no love connected to it. And it didn't have the same energy that I think when you pray from the heart or you pray with real love, then it means more, like vibrationally. And so I got to burst through all the prayers. And I remember thinking, hey, if I don't come back, I'll see you soon, because time had broken down for me. And there was God up ahead, and God was just this light. The light was overwhelming, but as I moved toward it, everything about my life that had been painful was beginning to be healed as I got closer to God. I just felt all the pain of physical existence kind of going away, and I felt loved. I felt free. I felt incredibly happy. This happiness, I can't even describe it here. If you take the most passionate love you've ever experienced, and also the love you have for a child or a pet, and you add like the coolest trip you've ever been on, international travel, and you put all that together, it's still not as amazing as God. So, like if you take all your best experiences and lump them together, it just doesn't compare. And a lot of near-death experiencers get very lonely and sad for God, because nothing at an earth level compares to being a spirit and getting close to that presence of God. And I wanted to keep going at that point. I did not want to come back. And the minute I had that thought, it was like I hit a vibrational wall, and I heard this voice that was beaming vibrationally. That's the best way to describe it. Sound isn't the same, sight isn't the same, but the voice of God was undeniable. It kind of shook me to my core. And what I felt this voice of God say was, look down. And as I looked down, I saw people who were either covered with a shadow or they were in the light. And someone asked me a very interesting question. You know, these researchers and people who interview me sometimes ask great questions. And this was a fantastic question that I'd never been asked. The researchers said, well, what percentage of people had darkness around them? And what percentage of people were connected to God, connected to the light? And then it kind of, you know, as I looked at it, and this was just like a sample population of people, um, more than half were covered with darkness. And the darkness, though, was not like evil. It could be negative thought forms. So it could simply be that someone's watching too much news and they're worried about, you know, the world situation, or could be that someone is dealing with depression and they're just kind of sad and they're not in that flow of God, and that, you know, they're not, could be that someone just has fear for someone else, and it could be just a moment where they are in, you know, the shadow and not connected to the light. But I understood that the people who were connected to the light were creative, excited about life. You know, they were naturally connected to God, whether or not they consciously understood that they were connected to God. They were excited about life. They were in a state of, I want to do good for this world. I want to, you know, create kindness and happiness and success for myself and others. They were just positive. You know, that was kind of like their thought forms were positive. Their connection to God was there. And was told by God in that moment, you're going to go back and you're going to work as a teacher, and you're going to remind people who have shadows of fear around them, or pain, how to connect to the light again, how to feel better about themselves and this life experience. And you're going to help people. And I saw that it was a direct mission, you know, not spiritual teacher, you know, but actual teacher, that I was going to work in school systems. And this was, in the school had been my way of finding peace from a tough childhood. So I kind of understood on some level that this was a good fit for me. But on another level, I was like, I grew up poor. I don't want to be a teacher. They don't make any money. And in that moment, I argued with God, and I said, no, I was going to go to law school. You know, like I was going to do something different with my life. And in that moment, and I argued with God, and I laugh at this now because people often say, do you retain your ego over there? Well, I'd have to say I did in that moment, but I was ejected out of heaven, you know, the minute my ego came into play. And so in that moment when I'm arguing with God, God kind of grabbed my soul and threw me back into my body. And so I understood that the last thing I heard from God was that I definitely needed to be a teacher. So looking at this part of my experience, I could never deny, you know, that the last words I heard from God were, you know, about my career. And not everyone has God as a guidance counselor. So on one hand, I was lucky, you know, like on the other hand, I did take a lot for me to swallow that. And luckily I had time because I had a pretty bad injury. So the next thing I knew, I was in the recovery room and nurses were handing me ice chips. And some near-death experiencers have to remember their experience, but I don't know why. Everyone processes things differently. I knew I'd had a near-death experience the minute they were putting ice chips into my mouth. I understood it completely, even though, you know, I was coming out of anesthesia. They were giving me morphine for the pain. Certainly, you know, I was addled, but I was different. And they asked me, say your name, you know, you have to say that coming out of surgery. And the first thing I said was, oh, her name is Tricia. And they were like, no, no, no. And I stopped for a minute, honestly, because my consciousness felt connected to the room, connected to them, connected to my surgeons. I still felt very, quote, large, as if I couldn't be contained in this body. And then I had to swallow it. And there was some sadness about coming back to the physical form. There was some like fear too of, oh, am I going to still deal with my emotional wounds that I got from growing up? Am I going to have a lot of physical pain? what is life going to be like as a teacher? Like there were some real human experiences that I felt. But then, it was so easy just to snap out of that and go, I was just with God. Like this is really amazing. And so, I had those thoughts and I accepted it. And I was like, my name is Tricia. And I was like, but I have to talk to my surgeon. Please bring her in. And they said she's doing rounds. She'll be back shortly. When Dr. Laura Flan walked in, I asked her, how long was I dead? That was the first thing that I asked her. And she looked kind of startled. And she was like, well, we did think that we lost you for a couple of minutes, but you're fine now. You're getting your third blood transfusion. Your head probably feels light. Please understand your surgery was successful. And she just gave me this look. And I had never been an intuitive, psychic on any level or able to read people, but it was almost like I could read her thought. And she was like, quit talking about this, for two reasons. One, she was a brilliant surgeon and she had just fixed my back. I was going to walk, I was going to run. And she was very excited. Her work was kind of pioneering at that time. That's the only thing she wanted to talk about was how successful the surgery is, not how she lost me for a couple of minutes. And secondly, she was thinking about giving me something, for my brain if I continued to talk about this, like maybe, like psych. There are near-death experiencers who have been institutionalized for talking about it too much in the hospital, and this look that she gave me was like, shut up, don't make me do this. And so I shut up, like I wasn't going to talk to her about it anymore. And I did talk to my family members about it. And I did talk to nurses. And I remember, I was definitely out of it, but nurses were checking me and I would say, hey, do you believe in God? And most of them would go, yeah, I do. And I was like, God is this great ball of light and the love is enormous. And they would start going, almost as if they didn't believe me. It was, no one was really, they were looking at me and I could tell that they thought, wow, she's on these powerful drugs. This is the drugs talking. And I was like, no, I really did have this experience. Well, my grandmother was the only person who was listening to me at that time. And she said, you saw angels? And my grandmother was Catholic and she has recently moved to the other side. And so she thought it was interesting that I had seen angels. And I was in ICU for 3 days, but when I got out of ICU, she went to the gift shop and gave me I'd been asking for a pen and paper because I wanted to write down my experience immediately. I was afraid that the morphine might, change my brain and I might not remember this most amazing experience of my life. So I wrote down what I remembered of the angels and my experience. And little did I know that this experience would be etched into my brain and I could never forget it. But, at that moment I was afraid. And other family members were pretty judgmental. And I saw, I kind of inherited some of that judgmental nature from them, that we learn things from our families. And the aunt who didn't pray for me with very much love, I heard her talking as if I couldn't hear. And she was like, I can't believe Tricia has tattoos. How disgusting. And I had like really tiny, tattoos that didn't have a sleeve or anything. But there was just this judgment of, what a bad girl. And then, my mom was saying, how could she have seen God? And I overheard this, that they were really judging me based on the fact that I was agnostic, that I was worldly, and not on the fact that I just had this experience. And I thought, oh, that's really painful that they're not being kind to me. It's all about them, where are they going to sleep? Where are they going to eat? They're here for me. But it was almost as if I was a non-entity as I was there. And I thought, ooh, my family's rough. I need to get some friends in here, who will notice me and talk to me. And so, oddly, my mom and family kept friends out. Obviously they couldn't see me in ICU, but it took 5 days. I was in the hospital 9 days. Finally, on the 5th day, I was able to see some friends from college, and I couldn't wait because these were fellow agnostics for the most part. And I was trying to convey what I had experienced. And then I was saddened by maybe their immaturity level. And I realized, oh, I had really just matured in a single moment, just at a real world level of having to be in the hospital, but also this near-death experience had changed me. I wasn't able to communicate this in the way that I wanted to with some of my friends. And honestly, it took 25 years to finally convince one of my agnostic friends to open her mind a little bit. When she read my book, she said she put it down and she spent the entire afternoon in meditation and just kind of thinking about what really happens when you die. And I was like, I finally got to her. I finally cracked open her consciousness just a little bit. But in that moment in the hospital, my friend was just thinking about how life can happen to any of us at any time, that a car wreck can, kill someone who's young, or it can almost kill someone. And that was the level of her consciousness. Well, out of all the people that I knew, it wasn't until my neighbor showed up, and I didn't know her that well, but she was spiritual. And I told her what happened, and she said, I believe you. I believe in these things. In fact, my roommate is a Reiki worker, and as soon as you get out of the hospital, we're going to write letters. We're going to talk on the phone. I want to hear all of it. And I just felt this sigh of relief, like, oh, finally, at least I know one person who isn't judging me and, is excited about this experience, because I was excited about it. I knew I had changed. I had gone from a depressed college student who made an attempt on her life at one point. There was a lot of pain that I was carrying. And I knew I was so different, that, there was so much light moving through me. I didn't have the full language that I have now for near-death experiences, but I knew I was different. I mean, sometimes I questioned if I was the same person, because I had changed so much. And that's a question now that people ask a lot. I don't think I was a walk-in. I think that I was just so deeply hurt and insecure and abused, really, that society had failed me. My parents had failed me. There was a lot of failures along the way. And this experience changed me. It gave me more of my power and my joy for life back. And that was a big change. It was almost like the essential Tricia that came into this world as a new soul. It was as if all the family stuff had been washed away. And honestly, I was kind of happy to be able to start a new relationship with my mother and with people, and kind of start over. And from that point, and so I left the hospital, and I did stay with my mom. My dad was, they were divorced at this time, obviously. And my dad was a great guy. He was funny. He never said an unkind thing to me, but he was an only child himself, and kind of in his own world. He fished a lot. He made enough money at sales just to take care of himself and have fun. And we had a relationship only because when I applied for Pell Grants, I realized that my father had made a little more money than the way we had lived. And so as a college student, I was kind of mad at him. And at 18, I basically said, I'm not going to have a relationship with you unless you help me with college. That you're either going to, I see how much money you make now. You've treated me like, like with money, very poorly. And so he paid for my housing the whole time I was at college. And so we had a relationship. My mother and I had a very strange relationship, because part of what I had gone through at college was therapy. And I realized some of the abuse. I didn't realize it before. I always kind of stood up for my mom and said, oh, she had a tough life, but my mother was severely physically abusive. And, it's hard to write about. Some people don't want to write about these things until the parent is dead. I followed my guidance and my angels, and my mom and I actually stopped talking for 7 years when I wrote the book, and I didn't know if I'd have a relationship with her ever again. Everything I wrote in the book was toned down, but I'll just say that there were moments of severe beatings, not just spankings that people talk about in the South, but like she took all of her rage out on a 4-year-old kid's body, and it was deep. It was very, very, very deep. And I had an uncle who was part of the church as well, and he had molested me at a young age, and it's a very young age. And so these two events, but not consistently. It was just this one moment that I remember, and these two events. So people who masqueraded as religious but did horrible things to kids really made me hate religion. Really, really made me think, okay, there's something demonic about these people. There's something, awful. And so one of the things that I've had to heal is to realize, like, we all need to judge one another at the heart level. Certainly, there are people in churches who are not good people. There are priests that molest kids, but there are also amazing priests. There are priests who are so wonderful to people and do real good work in this world. And so we can't judge anyone based on anything but their heart, like what they are doing in this world to really help people. So my assimilation back into body with that mom was challenging at times, but I had a better understanding, perhaps, of personality disorders, and I understood that my mom took advantage of people, me especially, who were vulnerable. And I was only vulnerable those first couple of days back home with her. And I realized, okay, to survive, I have to agree with everything she says, compliment her, tell her how grateful I am for her support. And she's a complicated character because she did love me. She brought me books, she brought me food, she housed me in her home. But that first night, and I write about this in my book, she was helping me to the toilet, and I was just in so much pain. I couldn't take pain medicine. I was vomiting it up. So I was feeling everything after the surgery, and my back just felt like a red hot poker. And I was crying, and she slapped me in the bathroom, and all of my childhood moments came back to me, and I just understood who she was. And I was like, this is someone who can't handle any amount of stress. She has so much stress in her own system that anyone who stresses her out and is vulnerable, she's going to take advantage of them, or she's going to control them. And so at that point, I was like, my only job is to heal my body, to meditate, learn about this near-death experience. And honestly, our relationship was fine from that point forward, because I understood just to treat her with positivity. I never said anything about being in pain from that first night moving forward. I just stayed upbeat and positive, and thank you for the books, and thank you for the lunch. And that's not an authentic way to live, but it was a way to survive. And in that moment, though, I got to think of all the kids all across the world and America who deal with abuse, and how can I help them as a teacher? What's the most efficient way to do this? And I started going through thinking about how I was going to be of use and how I was going to help people in the classroom. And I spent that year. Not every near-death experiencer gets a full year after their experience, but I was in a body cast. So there were 4 months in the body cast. There were months of learning to walk again, and months of physical therapy, which I mainly did in water once I was out of the body cast. And then I went back to college a year later. Well, not a year. It was less than a year, like 9 months later. And when I went back to college, everything that I interacted with it differently. So, Austin had been this party town. Well, suddenly now it was just this beautiful place where I could go hiking. I learned how to do yoga and meditate, and I connected with some spiritual people, both in San Antonio, where my mom lived, and also in Austin. And there was a really sweet group in San Antonio, kind of an older crowd. And I showed up to meditate in my body cast still, and they understood me. And I kind of, at 22, I was looking at older people who had just had knee surgery and hip replacement and all kind of things. I was like, we're kind of alike, and I was like, we're all in pain here, but we're going to get out of our bodies and meditate together. And so it was this cute moment where I kind of had some safe places to go. And at this, they called it the home, the couple that ran it. And she gave me books by Deepak Chopra and all kind of books. Like, they were really behind my spiritual growth at that time. And it was really beautiful. And to my mom's credit, she went to the library and got me all the spiritual books I wanted. And that 9 months in bed, I read like Carlos Castaneda and all kind of things about lucid dreaming. I was so different after my near-death experience. I spent so much time outside of my body, lucid dreaming, having out-of-body experiences, working with the angels to help heal my body quickly. Like, I was not the same person, and I was beginning to understand it. And I find it interesting. Now I've interviewed Raymond Moody and others, but at the time I was reading his books and thinking, these are the only people in the world who are going to understand me. Like, I just felt so different, and only people who understood NDE research. I thought, wow, I'm going to go through life, misunderstood to some level, but my mission is just to bring God's love here. So, I read these books, went back to college, participated with the world differently, but I was also 22, and this is where parts of my story are different from, when you're middle-aged. And, like, I've interviewed Eben Alexander and others. When you're middle-aged and you have a lot of money and security in life and you have a near-death experience, that's a different assimilation than when you're a college student or when you're a kid, that there's still growth that has to happen. So I was very torn. But I also understood the light. And what I was torn about is I wanted to connect with my friends, but a lot of them drank heavily. So I didn't want to be a part of that. So I just go have lunch with them or, meet them to work out. I started a new group of friends who were more spiritually minded, and we painted together. We did yoga together. I had a different crowd after the near-death experience, but I still loved my other friends. And so sometimes I'd pop into their world and have a drink. And I felt like alcohol and drugs dim people's light, and it dims their connection. So I was beginning to see, oh, some of the fear or the disconnection might be addiction. It could be depression. It could be other things. And so I tried to stay away from, the party scenes, because I didn't feel that the energy was good. I would go sometimes, and there was one party that I went to where there were a lot of people using drugs, a college party. And not just marijuana, which is legal in some states now, like, some heavy drugs. And there was this one guy, I started telling in the kitchen my near-death experience story, because I just tell people, randomly when I felt like it was asked or someone wanted to know. And people were curious, they were standing around listening to the story. And this one guy was so repelled by my story. It almost looked as if he was picked up and thrown out of the room. There was something within him, that did not want to hear about the light. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. So these layers of darkness, they're layers, like some people just have a small layer that's preventing them from feeling the connection to God, but other people are in the throes of something perhaps more intense. And so, there were all kind of interesting spiritual experiences along the way. And it was quite an adventure, but I didn't come forward. Today we have so many people telling their stories on YouTube, and there's such an influx of people just being open about it. I mean, I would tell people at parties, I would tell people who I got to know, I would tell every group of students that I ever had my near-death experience story. School districts didn't know this. I just took a chance, but the students loved it. Actually, they would tell me ghost stories. They would tell me, about feeling their grandparent in dreams. Like, it opened up a different way of relating to kids. And I'll always have this one class burned into my mind. I was teaching seniors in high school when 9/11 happened. And I hadn't told them my near-death experience story yet, but that next week I told it to them, and many of them were going to go into the military. One of them died, one of them was badly wounded. And so I felt this intensity of, we're connected in this moment in time, and it's a pivotal moment in time. And I want you to know, that love is all that you take with you. And, most of those students from that class still follow me on Facebook. Like there's something about 9/11 that just like grounded us together. And, there were, I taught 8th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, 10th grade. I taught in the public school system for a while. I taught overseas. I taught at boarding schools, fancy boarding schools along the East Coast. I taught at some of the worst school districts in the nation in New Orleans and Dallas. And believe it or not, in the Title I worst urban schools on the planet, you can do pretty much whatever you want. You can talk about spirituality all day long, as long as you're keeping those kids in the classroom. And I found that I had a unique way of dealing with the tough kids, the gangsters, and the ones who were really on the edge. One gangster kid, early on tested me, and he said, I'm going to bring a gun in here and point it right at your head and take you out. And I just looked at him and I said, I don't care. Do me a favor and take me out of here. That would mean I can go back to God and I can go back to the light, and I don't have to work at this awful school system that doesn't care about you. And, you don't want to listen to me and blah, blah, blah. I just went on and I was like, please do. That would mean I get to go home to God. And he was so stunned. He just like shuffled away and said, well, I'm going to steal your hubcaps. And I was like, I'm giving them to you. And so that was our interaction. And, I think being able to play with kids at this level and kind of be disconnected from, just their thought forms that were often created because they grew up in abusive homes. I had a way with kids who were rebellious, who had been abused, who were mad at their family, mad at church. I also worked with 3 girls who no teachers wanted to touch these girls. Like they were doing some hard drugs in 8th grade and they were into some rough things, and they had burned down a church in town, and they were in a little trailer behind the school. Not a single teacher would talk to them. I went there and the police officer was there with them. And I said, we're going to have a different kind of English class, and I'm going to come here every day on my break, and I'm going to take your work and you're going to read self-help books, and you're going to write about your behavior, think about what you've done, think about how you can live a more productive life. And we're going to just take accountability for your part in life. And so I worked with those girls, and one of them got into University of North Texas, and she emailed me and she said, that accountability thing that you did with me in 8th grade, I suddenly realized I was throwing my life away and that I was angry about certain things, and I got my life on track. And she said, I can't say that it made much of a difference in the other 2 girls' life, but I'm at college and I'm different. And so, it was good to know and good to see over time that it was almost as if I had a soul contract with certain students. I was meant to prevent suicides, help some students make it through abusive homes. I was really meant to be in the classroom. And the interesting thing is I always felt God the minute I stepped into the classroom, because that was my mission. I would go into the bathroom, sometimes when I met students for the first time, I wasn't nervous, but I would just pray and say, angels, work through me. I give this over to you. Do what you need with me. And I think because I didn't have this ego connected to teaching, I was able to just be in that flow of God. To me, it was like, oh, this low-paying job that God made me do. So I was able to hand it over to God and let God work through me. And God and the angels did. I didn't always tell students, but sometimes their grandparents would come through and tell me certain things that I needed to tell them, or sometimes I would see their angels working with them. And I've taught meditation long before it was allowable or even popular in schools. And I was kind of a rebel teacher. Some of the principals would describe the teachers, and this one principal, he was like, well, some of our teachers are very conservative and authoritarian. Some teachers are passionate about their subject matter, and some teachers just can't be classified. And he was looking at me. It was hard to classify me because the students loved me. And I think that's always been my saving grace, is even at the college level. I'm popular, like with students, because they understand that I work for them, that I really am more of a motivational coach, or I'm there to help their self-esteems. I'm there to help them, not for my own ego, because this isn't the career I would have chosen. It's the career that was chosen for me. And what I've learned is that being of service, even telling the story, even interviewing other people and telling these stories, is the most important part. But what I've liked about education, and maybe even more than spiritual communities, is the fact that, education is safe. There are police officers there, there are principals. There is a level of hierarchy that doesn't allow for abusive behavior. So, when students bullied one another, I had ways of dealing with this creatively, but there was a punishment. I think in spiritual communities, there sometimes isn't a punishment for abuse, like a distancing yourself from abusive people, whether this is churches or spiritual communities. And abuse should not be tolerated. It should be stood up to, because it dims the light of other people. It creates unsafe environments. And I always stood up in the educational systems for children who were abused by parents, and occasionally when boundaries were just incorrect with other instructors. I wouldn't say that I was always the most popular of teachers, because I would call out bad behavior. So, there was one coach who was really too handsy with 8th grade girls, just hugging them. And, I confronted that. There was another teacher who was sleeping with students, the 12th grade students. I confronted this. I turned one school district in to be investigated, because I felt like the monies were not appropriately being given to children, that maybe the monies were being used in inappropriate ways. So justice was kind of part of what I was working for as well, that the students deserved the money that taxpayers were giving, to have books and to have chairs. And if principals were using this money, for their own gain, this was not right. And so, I had this innate sense of justice. That was a part of what I did as well. But love is, punishment is often misunderstood. It can be done in a loving way, in a growth way. So the students who were bullying, I asked that they not, and this is Texas, so some of them were still, facing corporal punishment, spanking and all this. I asked that not a single one of my students ever receive that type of punishment, that I would give up my own lunch break to talk with them, that they didn't get to have lunch with their friends. They had to have lunch with me. That was their punishment. And so, it was a loving punishment, but it was a way to get into their heads and start seeing where they're coming from. And so this one group of girls that had bullied, this lovely, lovely Down syndrome child, a group of teenagers who, it was horrible. They spent a month with me. I really worked on those girls' minds and got them to understand that all of my interactions with the student who had Down syndrome were pure love. And I really kind of showed them how vibrationally she was their teacher, that even though they bullied her, she still interacted with them with love. And by the end of that month, they were crying, and they understood what they had done. But I was in their heads. And so that was really more my punishment, is teaching students how to be different. And I do believe that when you catch bullying behavior and sociopathic behavior and some really tough things at the 8th grade level, you can change kids. That's a time when you can reorient them on a different path. And so a lot of this work of the world was hard. It was work where I was on the phone with CPS, where I was realizing there are parts of our society that are broken. We do not give enough money and enough help and enough time to social workers who are trying to help in these situations that, basically, if a kid is very young, sometimes will help, but teenagers were just kind of thrown out. And so many times I had to teach teenagers how to get through really tough situations, how to live with a grandparent, how to get a job, how to uh, navigate life differently and in a safe way for themselves. So, not everything was easy after the near-death experience, but it was doable because I was supported by the other side. There was a great love. There was a great support. I did feel my angels sometimes working through me. And at the college level, there's a lot more lecturing. At the junior high and high school level, you're working a lot more individually, but sometimes I had classrooms of 50 students at the college level. And what I would feel is like, myself kind of shifted out of the way, almost as if I was channeling, and this is the way channelers talk about it. My voice didn't change though. I kept my voice because that's just weird. That shouldn't be judgmental, but but the angels would come through and I wouldn't even remember sometimes what was said, but I'd have students cry after class and tell me certain things. I'd have students say that they realized what type of work they needed to go into. And one girl immediately joined the Peace Corps right after college. Like there was a lot of help that students wanted to give to this world as well. And it was almost as if they were activated at that moment through something I said. And it's not me, it really, at this other level, we can be activated by anyone who the light is working through. And I understood that. And so there were just certain activation points that students needed, and they needed that light to come through. And I was used in that way. And the most beautiful aspect, I think, of returning to this world and integrating the near-death experience is just knowing that maybe I made someone's life a little easier or helped them on their journey. That's the great joy, is those students. And I realized that God just wanted me to be kind to these students. A lot of times it wasn't complicated. A lot of times they didn't hear one positive thing about themselves that whole day until I said, hey, what you wrote here was really interesting. I want to hear more. Can you write more about this subject? And no one had ever said that to them about their writing, about their thoughts, about their thinking, about their personality. I didn't compliment people on the outward stuff. I complimented them on their character, their abilities, their interests, their dreams, their drives, and that's all I was there to do. It's just to be kind and uplifting and a cheerleader for all these souls coming through my classrooms, and it has made for a beautiful life. I mean, like, I am enormously blessed, and the most fun parts to write in my book were the parts about the students, because the students made this journey amazing. I love the Q&A part of these talks. So before we get into that, I don't know how we divide up the time, but I want to answer some misconceptions about mediumship and other things along those lines. I didn't publicly tell my story on I Survived Beyond and Back until around, I think that was 2010, 11, 12, somewhere in there. I connected with Dr. Jan Holden in Dallas because I'm in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And she wanted me to tell my story. And so I did. And I thought, okay, that'll be the only time I ever tell this story. Well, fast forward years later on YouTube, I saw some of those stories from I Survived have made it to YouTube, and mine hadn't. The guy, there were three people in my section, and the guy after me saw Jesus, so his story was a lot more popular than mine. And I thought, you know what? I'll just put my story on YouTube. And then I thought, no, maybe I shouldn't. And I went back and forth for a long time. And then I went into meditation, and I was like, okay, God, tell me, I had a stalker out there. I I didn't know if it was right for me to be out there on YouTube or not. And what I saw were all these angels and these light beings in this meditation. And of all things, they said, please do just make at least this first video. They said, do that because there are some people in Spain who need this. And I was like, Spain? Okay. But I don't speak Spanish. And I was like, that's weird. So I made the first video, and it kind of circulated around for a while. And this guy who was an actor translated it into Spanish, and he gave me the translations. I uploaded it to YouTube, and then out of nowhere, it was America, my demographics were America, and then Spain just shot up. And I was like, oh, they were right. Like for about a week or two there, a lot of people in Spain were downloading my story and listening to it. And I thought, okay, so I'm guided, beyond the classroom. And then a few weeks later, I heard this message from God, and it kind of took me by surprise because I was having some health issues at that time. My thyroid was really wacky, and the doctor had called me and said, we can't believe that you're up and walking around. Like, you have no thyroid. Like, get to the ER right now. And there were just some physical things that were happening. And I heard this message from God that said, your mission is complete. You can do whatever you want. And I thought, am I gonna die soon? What do you do when your mission is complete? And so I have still continued to teach, at the college level, because I have a great job and I still love it, and it still is a mission. Oh, but I kind of branched out and I started interviewing other near-death experiencers. I started telling my story more often, and then I was very reluctant about it, but a lot of parents who had lost children started contacting me, and they wanted me to give them a medium reading. And the first ones I gave were just through email. And I was like, okay, but I know I can connect with my people over there, but I don't know if I can connect with your people or not. Let's see it. And just, I won't charge you. And I went into meditation, and the first guy that I saw, he had died about 22, just like when I had a car wreck, and he had died of a car wreck. He gave me so many verifiable details. It was really kind of overwhelming. He told me about the dog that his mom had lost. He told me some specific things to tell her. She had left her husband, and she was drinking a lot and eating bad food. And he said, Mom, and I didn't know this about her. He was like, Mom, you're not doing well. I want you to either go back to Dad and get a hug from Dad and get back together with Dad, or start dating someone who can help you. I don't want you to suffer in life. This was not your fault. I have your dog, and I'm still good looking. He messed with his hair, and he showed me, what he looked like. And so I told her all these things, and he was the youngest boy of 7 girls, and they always told him how handsome he was, and he'd run through the house, and he was just loved by all his sisters and mom. And they had lost the dog, the family dog, which everyone knew was her dog, and it was this white dog. And I described the little white dog, and he was holding the dog in heaven. And she said, yeah, I am living in an apartment away from my husband, and all I do is just drink myself to bed every night, just drink away the pain. And she's like, okay, thank you for all these messages. The most important one was the one that it's not my fault, because he had asked her a few weeks before his accident. He had cardboard on his driver's side. And he said, should I get my window fixed, or should I wait until my paycheck? She said, wait until your paycheck. A couple of days later, he was T-boned and killed. And so she felt like I told him the wrong thing. And he told me, that this accident would have happened either way, and that she needed to not carry that guilt. And so when that guilt was relieved in her, she went back to her husband. And she said, I lost 50 pounds. I'm doing better. I'm working with helping parents heal. I'm in a better place now. And I was kind of shocked that a reading like that could help someone on their healing journey. And so I said, okay, fine, God, if this is what is meant to be, all teachers in the summer usually have a part-time job anyway. I'll do this as a part-time job. I'll work with people in grief, and if they want to connect with their angels, if they want to connect with their loved ones, or if they really just want to talk about these things. I get some calls from people who are surrounded by either atheist or very evangelical religious people. So I'll get like a husband or wife on the phone and they're like, no one believes the things I believe. I just want to talk to you for an hour. And so we'll talk about everything, on their spiritual journey. And I am so blessed to be able to connect with people, to be able to do this. And it really does kind of feel like an extension of teaching. I get to, for a moment, be there with people who are loving and who are kind and just on a spiritual journey. There's so much to all of this, and each telling of the story brings out certain aspects, but I like to jump to the Q&A early because it's you who I really care about.